Imagine a single thread of silk that bankrupted the Roman Empire. Not armies or plagues or political collapse, but a shimmering strand so beautiful, so impossibly soft, that Roman senators passed laws trying to stop their citizens from buying it. They called it woven wind and worried it would drain their treasury dry. Roman women hid bolts of it like contraband. Roman men wore it secretly, despite laws forbidding them to touch such effeminate luxury. This thread came from a place Romans could barely imagine. A distant empire where people ate with sticks, wrote in pictures, and guarded the secret of silk making with their lives. The penalty for smuggling silkworms out of China? Death. Yet somehow impossibly, this thread traveled 4,000 miles across the most brutal landscapes on Earth. Through deserts where men went mad from thirst and saw cities that weren't there. Over mountain passes so high that travelers bled from their eyes. Past bandits who buried caravans alive and nomad armies that appeared like storms and vanished like smoke. The thread survived because people died for it. Merchants who risked everything on a single caravan. Monks who carried sacred texts sewn into their robes. Princesses sent as diplomatic gifts to foreign courts, smuggling silk-making secrets in their hair ornaments. Ordinary people who believed that somewhere beyond the horizon lay wonders worth any price. This is the story of the Silk Road. Not really a road at all, but a living network of human ambition that connected 3 continents for over 1,000 years. It carried more than silk. It carried the secrets of gunpowder and the printing press. It carried Buddhism from India to China. It carried the Black Death from Asia to Europe. It carried stories that would reshape how humans saw themselves and their world. Marco Polo followed these routes and returned with tales so fantastic that people called him a liar. Chinese explorers ventured west and brought back horses that could sweat blood. Arab scholars translated Greek philosophy and sent it eastward. The entire medieval world was built on connections forged by merchants brave enough or desperate enough to risk everything for the promise of distant gold. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. It wasn't empires or armies that created the Silk Road. It was individuals. People who looked at impossible distances and said, "I can cross that." Who saw cultural barriers and said, "I can bridge that." Who faced the unknown and said, "I can survive that." Their journeys took months, sometimes years. Many never returned. Yet they kept going, driven by something deeper than profit, the irrepressible human need to connect, to discover, to touch the impossible. Tonight you'll follow in their footsteps. Across deserts and mountains, through cities that glittered like jewels and markets that smelled like paradise. You'll meet the dreamers and traders, the explorers and exiles who wove the world together with threads of silk and strands of pure human courage. The greatest adventure in human history begins now. If this story resonates with you, support me by subscribing to Historia Res. Your support is the motivation I need to keep long before the first Chinese caravan crossed the Gobi Desert. Long before Roman gold flowed eastward for silk, the seeds of connection were already sprouting across the ancient world. Picture the year 3000 BCE, a time when most humans never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. Yet somehow, impossibly, jade from the mountains of western China was being carved into ceremonial axes in the distant valleys of Europe. How did this happen? Who were these forgotten pioneers of global trade? Meet the world's first international businessman, a Sumerian merchant standing in the dusty marketplace of Ur, turning over a piece of lapis lazuli in his weathered hands. The stone is impossibly blue, the color of deep ocean or midnight sky, and it came from mines in Afghanistan. A journey of over 1,000 miles through hostile territory. He's never seen Afghanistan. He doesn't even know it exists. But here in his palm lies proof that somewhere, somehow, people are moving precious things across vast distances. The merchant doesn't know he's holding the future in his hands. He doesn't know that this single stone represents humanity's first tentative steps toward becoming a connected world. He just knows it's beautiful and rare, and that the wealthy priestess who commissioned a necklace will pay him well for it. This is how it began, not with grand visions of international commerce, but with simple human desires. Beauty, status, the irresistible appeal of owning something that came from the edge of the known world. In the Indus Valley, sophisticated traders were developing the world's first standardized weights and measures. Bronze Age caravans were following seasonal routes through Central Asia, carrying obsidian from Turkey, tin from Cornwall, amber from the Baltic. These weren't the organized trade networks we'll see later. They were more like a global game of telephone, with goods passing hand to hand through dozens of middlemen, each adding their own markup and mystery. But then came the revolution that changed everything. The domestication of the camel. Picture this moment around 3000 BCE in the Arabian Peninsula. A nameless herder approaches a wild camel, a creature that can go weeks without water, carry 400 pounds without complaint, and navigate by instinct across trackless desert. Most animals, when domesticated, become smaller and gentler than their wild cousins. Not camels. They remain magnificently stubborn, gloriously adapted to the world's harshest environments. This quiet revolution unleashed human ambition like nothing before. Suddenly, the great barriers that had divided civilizations, the Sahara, the Gobi, the Arabian Desert, became highways. What had been impossible became merely difficult. What had been unthinkable became profitable. By 2000 BCE, Bronze Age traders were pushing deeper into Central Asia, following river valleys and mountain passes that would later become the backbone of the Silk Road. They carried bronze weapons from the Caucasus, precious stones from Persia, and always, they carried stories. Tales of distant lands where people dressed differently, spoke strangely, worshipped unfamiliar gods. In ancient Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets record the wonder of merchants encountering foreign goods for the first time. One Assyrian trader writes of mountain wool, probably cotton from India, as if describing something magical. Another describes Chinese silk as the thread of the gods, though he has no idea where it actually comes from. These early traders were driven by more than profit. They were driven by curiosity, that essential human hunger to know what lies beyond the horizon. They were the first globalists, the first people to imagine a world where distance wasn't destiny, where the products of one civilization could enrich another. They couldn't have known they were laying the foundation for the greatest trade network in history. They were just following their instincts, their ambitions, their very human desire to turn the unknown into opportunity. But in their simple acts of courage, loading a camel, crossing a desert, trusting a stranger in a foreign market, they were weaving the first threads of what would become the Silk Road. The stage was set. The routes were established. The precedent was clear. Impossible distances could be crossed, cultural barriers could be bridged, and somewhere out there in lands beyond imagination lay wonders worth any risk. All that remained was for someone bold enough to make it official. In the year 138 BCE, a young Chinese diplomat named Zhang Qian set out on what should have been a routine mission. Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty had heard rumors of powerful kingdoms to the west, potential allies against the troublesome Xiongnu nomads who constantly raided China's borders. Zhang Qian's job was simple: find these western kingdoms, forge an alliance, and return home within 2 years. He didn't return for 13 years. What happened to Zhang Qian during those lost years would accidentally create the greatest trade network in human history. But first, he had to survive being captured, enslaved, and held prisoner for over a decade by the very nomads he was trying to outflank. Picture Zhang Qian in captivity among the Xiongnu, a refined court diplomat forced to live as a nomad, learning to milk mares and sleep under stars, slowly absorbing the rhythms of pastoral life. His captors weren't cruel. They gave him a Xiongnu wife, children, a place in their society. They probably assumed he would eventually forget his distant emperor and accept his new life. They were wrong. After 10 years of patient waiting, Zhang Qian escaped. But instead of fleeing directly home, he continued west on his original mission. This decision, to push deeper into the unknown rather than retreat to safety, would change the course of world history. What Zhang Qian discovered beyond the Xiongnu territories defied every assumption the Chinese had made about the world. He found not barbarian wastelands, but sophisticated kingdoms with vast cities, complex politics, and, most surprisingly, an urgent desire to trade with China. In the Fergana Valley of modern Uzbekistan, Zhang Qian encountered something that took his breath away. Horses that seemed to sweat blood. These weren't the sturdy ponies of northern China, but tall, elegant creatures with flowing manes and supernatural speed. Local legends claimed they were descended from dragons, born in the clouds and gifted to mortals by the gods. The truth was almost as fantastical. These heavenly horses were ancestors of the modern Akalteke breed, their coats so fine they seemed to glow with an inner light. When they sweated, parasites under their skin created red-tinged moisture that looked like blood. To Zhang Qian, accustomed to Chinese horses, they seemed like creatures from myth. But the horses were just the beginning. In the markets of Samarkand and Bukhara, Zhang Qian saw goods that had no names in Chinese. Glass so clear it seemed made of frozen water, carpets woven with patterns that seemed to move in lamplight, spices that could transform the simplest meal into a feast fit for immortals. Most intriguing of all, he saw Chinese silk being sold at prices that would have made him wealthy beyond imagination back home. The implications hit him like a thunderbolt. China wasn't the only sophisticated civilization in the world. There were other empires out there: Parthia, Bactria, the distant Roman territories, and they desperately wanted Chinese goods. More importantly, they had things China wanted just as desperately. When Zhang Qian finally returned to the Chinese capital of Chang'an in 125 BCE, he brought with him more than reports and exotic gifts. He brought a vision of interconnected prosperity that captured Emperor Wu's imagination completely. Emperor Wu was a ruler who thought in centuries, not years. He understood immediately what Zhang Qian's discoveries meant. China could become fabulously wealthy by controlling trade with these Western kingdoms. But first, they needed those heavenly horses. Chinese cavalry was no match for nomad horsemen on their swift ponies. With horses like the ones Zhang Qian described, China could finally achieve military supremacy over the steppes. The emperor launched a series of military expeditions to secure both the horses and the trade routes. It was expensive. One campaign alone cost China nearly a quarter of its annual revenue. But the investment paid off spectacularly. By 100 BCE, regular caravans were traveling between China and Central Asia, carrying silk westward and bringing back horses, jade, and exotic luxuries. The silk itself became China's secret weapon in this new form of economic warfare. Roman historians wrote in amazement about this mysterious fabric that seemed to capture light itself. Pliny the Elder complained that Roman gold was flowing eastward at an alarming rate, depleting the empire's treasury for what he considered a frivolous luxury. But here's what the Romans didn't understand. They weren't just buying fabric. They were buying mystery, exoticism, the tangible proof that somewhere beyond their borders lay wonders they couldn't imagine. Chinese silk became the ultimate status symbol precisely because it was impossible to replicate. The Chinese guarded the secrets of silk production with the same intensity they guarded military secrets. Anyone caught trying to smuggle silkworms out of China faced execution. This created the perfect economic storm. Desperate demand in the West, limited supply in the East, and thousands of miles of dangerous terrain in between. The markup was extraordinary. Silk that sold for its weight in gold in China could fetch 10 times that price in Rome. But the risks were proportional to the profits. Caravans faced bandits, blizzards, political upheavals, and the constant possibility of getting lost in landscapes so vast, they swallowed entire expeditions without trace. Zhang Qian's accidental discovery had unleashed forces that neither he nor Emperor Wu could have anticipated. They thought they were establishing diplomatic relations and securing horses for their cavalry. Instead, they had opened a valve that would release 2 millennia of human ambition, courage, and greed across the steppes and deserts of Central Asia. The merchants came first. Chinese, Sogdian, Parthian, eventually Roman. Then came the missionaries, carrying Buddhism from India toward China and Nestorian Christianity from Syria toward Mongolia. Then came the scholars, the artists, the adventurers, the exiles, all following the routes that Zhang Qian had pioneered. By the 1st century CE, the Silk Road had become self-sustaining. It no longer depended on imperial sponsorship or diplomatic missions. It had become something entirely new in human history. A truly international economy, driven not by conquest or politics, but by the simple recognition that people separated by vast distances could enrich each other's lives. All because a young diplomat refused to give up on an impossible mission, and an emperor was wise enough to recognize opportunity when it walked into his throne room, carrying tales of horses that sweated blood, and markets where Chinese silk sold for the price of kingdoms. The thread was spinning. The network was live. The real adventure was just beginning. By the 2nd century CE, something extraordinary was happening across the known world. In Rome, senators' wives draped themselves in silk so fine it seemed woven from captured starlight. In Chang'an, the Chinese capital, foreign merchants hawked glass vessels that rang like bells when tapped. In the markets of Samarkand, you could buy Buddhist prayer wheels carved from African ivory, or taste wine made from grapes grown in the shadow of the Himalayas. The Silk Road had become more than a trade route. It was the circulatory system of human civilization itself. At the heart of this golden age were the Sogdians, perhaps history's most successful merchants. Based in cities like Samarkand and Bukhara in modern Uzbekistan, these Iranian-speaking traders became the indispensable middlemen of the Silk Road. They spoke dozens of languages, understood the customs of every major culture from Rome to China, and most importantly, they were trusted by everyone. Picture a Sogdian merchant named Vakshuvar in his counting house in Samarkand, surrounded by ledgers written in 6 different scripts. Chinese silk hangs from wooden beams, alongside Persian carpets and Indian cotton. Roman glass catches the light from bronze lamps burning Syrian olive oil. On his desk lies a contract written in Sogdian, authorizing the purchase of horses from the Fergana Valley for delivery to a Buddhist monastery in Gandhara. This was the miracle of the Sogdians. They made the impossible routine. They created a system of credit that worked across continents, established trusted agents in every major city, and developed a reputation for honest dealing that made long-distance trade possible. When a Chinese merchant in Chang'an wanted to buy Roman glass, he didn't need to travel 4,000 miles. He paid a Sogdian agent who sent word to Sogdian partners in Damascus, who purchased the glass and sent it eastward. The whole transaction might take 6 months, but it worked with clockwork precision. But the Sogdians were carrying more than goods. They were carrying ideas that would reshape human consciousness itself. Buddhism, born in the gardens and palaces of northern India, was spreading eastward along the Silk Road like seeds on a fertile wind. Buddhist monks traveled with the caravans, not just for protection, but because the merchants themselves were becoming converts. The religion's emphasis on compassion and its promise of salvation through good deeds appealed to people who spent their lives taking enormous risks to help strangers. In the oasis town of Dunhuang, on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, this fusion of commerce and spirituality created something unprecedented. The Mogao Caves, carved into cliffs overlooking the Silk Road, became a treasury of Buddhist art unlike anything seen before or since. Imagine walking into Cave 285 in the year 500 CE, your eyes adjusting to the lamplight and seeing walls covered with frescoes depicting Buddha surrounded by Persian princes, Chinese courtiers, and Central Asian nomads, all united in devotion. The paintings tell stories of transformation. Here's a Chinese merchant who donated his entire fortune to build a monastery after surviving a sandstorm that should have killed him. There's a Sogdian trader who became a monk after witnessing the execution of bandits who had robbed his caravan, suddenly understanding the Buddhist teaching about the interconnectedness of all suffering. But perhaps the most moving story is painted in Cave 257, the tale of a monk leaving his family to carry Buddhist scriptures across the desert. The artist shows him at the moment of departure, tears streaming down his face as he embraces his wife and children one last time. His mother clutches his robes, begging him not to go. But behind him, painted in gold leaf, stand the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, their faces radiant with compassion. The monk knows he may never return. The desert has swallowed countless pilgrims, and the journey to India takes years. But he also knows that somewhere beyond the horizon, people are waiting for the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings that can liberate them from suffering. His personal sacrifice becomes a cosmic act of love. This was the spiritual dimension of the Silk Road's golden age. It wasn't just about profit or politics. It was about the recognition that human beings separated by vast distances shared common hopes, fears, and longings. Buddhism provided a vocabulary for that recognition, a way of understanding that individual suffering was part of a universal pattern that could be healed through compassion. Meanwhile, in Rome, the demand for silk had reached almost pathological levels. The Emperor Caligula scandalized the Senate by appearing in public wearing silk robes, leading to laws restricting silk imports to protect the empire's gold reserves. But the laws were impossible to enforce. Roman women had discovered that silk draped differently than wool or linen, that it moved with the body like liquid light. They smuggled it, hoarded it, traded family heirlooms for it. Roman writers complained that their empire was being feminized by Eastern luxury, but they couldn't stop buying it. Pliny the Elder calculated that the empire was losing 100 million sesterces annually to silk imports, enough money to fund several legions. So that a Roman woman may flaunt transparent clothing in public, he wrote bitterly, the forests of China are being stripped bare. What Pliny didn't understand was that Romans weren't just buying silk, they were buying connection to a larger world. Every bolt of silk carried with it the mystery of distant China, the romance of impossible journeys, the proof that somewhere beyond the empire's borders lay civilizations capable of creating beauty that Rome couldn't match. The cultural exchange flowed both ways. Chinese artisans began incorporating Roman glass techniques into their own work. Persian carpet weavers adopted Chinese silk-making methods. Indian mathematicians and Arab astronomers found eager students in Chinese academies. The Kushan Empire, straddling the routes between India and China, became a melting pot where Greek sculpture met Buddhist philosophy and Persian poetry. But the Golden Age wasn't without its dangers. The very success of the Silk Road attracted predators. Bandit gangs controlled mountain passes, demanding tribute from caravans. Nomad confederations raided settled communities, carrying off goods and captives. Political upheavals could close routes for years, forcing merchants to find new paths across landscapes that existed more in hope than on any map. Consider the psychological toll on the merchants themselves. A typical journey from China to Rome took over a year, assuming nothing went wrong. Merchants left their families, not knowing if they would ever return. They carried letters from home until the paper crumbled, treasured small objects that connected them to distant loved ones, and often died alone in foreign lands, their bones bleaching in desert sand. Yet they kept going. Generation after generation, they loaded their camels and headed into the unknown, driven by something deeper than greed. They were part of humanity's first truly global community, bound together not by politics or religion, but by the simple recognition that the world was full of wonders worth any risk to obtain. The Sogdian letters found in the Taklamakan Desert tell us their stories. A merchant writes to his wife, "The roads are dangerous, but the profits are good. If heaven permits, I will be home before the spring rains." Another letter, never sent, was found clutched in the skeletal hand of a trader who died in a sandstorm. "Tell my son that the jade he asked for is hidden in the false bottom of the blue chest. Tell him his father thought of him every day." These were people who understood that distance was just another obstacle to overcome, that cultural differences were just languages to be learned, that the world was vast enough to contain infinite possibilities for human connection. By the 7th century CE, the Silk Road had reached its full flowering. From Lisbon to Beijing, from Novgorod to Delhi, goods and ideas flowed along networks so complex they defied any single authority's control. The world had become, for the first time in human history, truly interconnected. But even as the Golden Age reached its peak, forces were gathering that would transform the Silk Road once again. New empires were rising, new religions were spreading, and new technologies were emerging that would change how humans thought about distance, time, and the very nature of connection itself. The thread was still spinning, but the pattern was about to change. In the year 751 CE, two great empires collided in a valley in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. The battle would last only 5 days, but its consequences would ripple across the Silk Road for centuries. Chinese forces representing the Tang dynasty faced Arab armies fighting for the expanding Abbasid Caliphate. When the dust settled at the Battle of Talas, more than territory had changed hands. The very nature of human knowledge was about to be transformed. Among the Chinese prisoners taken that day were skilled craftsmen who knew the closely guarded secret of papermaking. Under interrogation, they revealed techniques that had been Chinese state secrets for over 5 centuries. Within decades, paper mills were operating in Samarkand, Baghdad, and Damascus. The knowledge that had once been locked in Chinese imperial archives began flowing westward along the very trade routes that had carried silk and spices. This was the new reality of the Silk Road's middle period, a world where empires clashed not just for territory, but for the control of ideas themselves. The 7th century had brought unprecedented changes to the ancient trade networks. In the Arabian Peninsula, a merchant named Muhammad had received revelations that would unite the fractious Arab tribes into a conquering force. Within a century of the Prophet's death, Islamic armies had swept across 3 continents, creating an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. Suddenly, much of the Silk Road lay under the green banner of Islam. In Baghdad, the new Abbasid capital, Caliph Harun al-Rashid held court in a palace that seemed torn from the tales of 1001 Nights. Here, in the early 9th century, the House of Wisdom became a beacon of learning that drew scholars from across the known world. Picture the scene: a Chinese Buddhist monk discussing astronomy with a Jewish physician, while a Persian poet translates Greek philosophy into Arabic, all gathered around tables laden with manuscripts written in a dozen different scripts. The Islamic world had become obsessed with knowledge, not just religious learning, but the practical sciences that made trade and administration possible. Arab mathematicians refined Indian numerals into the system we still use today. Persian geographers mapped trade routes with unprecedented accuracy. Syrian merchants developed credit systems that allowed a trader in Cordoba to draw funds from a bank in Samarkand. But perhaps most remarkably, Islamic scholars began systematically translating the great works of antiquity: Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, Indian mathematics, Chinese technical manuals. All were rendered into Arabic and preserved in libraries that stretched from Baghdad to Cairo to Cordoba. When Christian Europe was burning books as pagan corruption, the Islamic world was collecting them as treasures. Meanwhile, in China, the Tang dynasty was reaching heights of cosmopolitan splendor that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Chang'an, the Tan capital, had become the largest city in the world, home to over 1 million people representing dozens of nationalities. Walking through the Western market, you might encounter Persian merchants selling precious stones, Arab traders offering frankincense, Indian monks debating philosophy, and Central Asian musicians playing instruments that had no Chinese names. The Tang emperors embraced this diversity with an enthusiasm that seems almost modern. Foreign fashions became the height of sophistication. Chinese ladies adopted Persian hairstyles and rode horses in the Central Asian manner. Foreign religions were tolerated and even encouraged. The Emperor Xuanzang patronized Buddhist monasteries, Nestorian Christian churches, and Zoroastrian fire temples with equal generosity. But this cosmopolitan golden age created its own tensions. Traditional Chinese scholars worried that foreign influences were corrupting pure Chinese culture. Confucian officials complained that Buddhist monasteries were accumulating too much wealth and power. Most ominously, the Tang military was increasingly dependent on foreign mercenaries. Sogdian cavalry, Turkish archers, Arab engineers, whose loyalty to Chinese interests was questionable at best. The cultural exchange flowed in directions that would have surprised earlier generations. Chinese glassware, perfected through techniques learned from Syrian craftsmen, found its way to Viking graves in Scandinavia. Chinese porcelain, decorated with Persian motifs, was buried in Egyptian tombs. Arab coins minted in Baghdad have been found in Swedish archaeological sites, carried there by traders who followed rivers from the Caspian Sea to the Baltic. Consider the remarkable journey of a single coin, a silver dirham, minted in Baghdad in 820 CE. It travels north with a caravan trading in furs and amber, changes hands in the markets of Bukhara, moves through the Khazar kingdom along the Volga River, and eventually ends up in the pouch of a Viking warrior who carries it to his grave in a Swedish burial mound. That coin represents a network of trust and exchange that spanned half the known world. But the most profound changes were happening in the realm of ideas. Buddhism, which had traveled eastward along the Silk Road in earlier centuries, was now encountering Islam as it spread westward. In the borderlands of Central Asia, Buddhist monasteries and Islamic madrasas existed side by side. Their scholars engaged in debates that pushed both traditions toward new insights. The encounter between Islamic monotheism and Buddhist philosophy produced some of the most sophisticated theological discussions in human history. Muslim scholars like al-Biruni traveled to India to study Buddhist and Hindu texts, translating them into Arabic with the same care they devoted to Greek philosophy. Buddhist monks in Central Asia began incorporating Islamic geometric patterns into their art, creating fusion styles that existed nowhere else on Earth. Yet this golden age of cultural exchange was increasingly overshadowed by political tensions. The Tang dynasty's expansion westward brought it into direct conflict with Islamic expansion eastward. The Battle of Talas was just the most dramatic example of what was becoming a regular occurrence. Proxy wars fought by empires that officially maintained diplomatic relations. The psychological impact on merchants and travelers was profound. Routes that had been safe for centuries suddenly became battlegrounds. A Sogdian trader might find that a war between distant empires had closed the mountain passes he'd been using for 30 years. A Buddhist pilgrim might discover that the monastery where he'd planned to rest had been destroyed in a conflict that had nothing to do with his faith. The old certainties were crumbling. The Silk Road had always been dangerous, but the dangers had been predictable. Bandits, weather, the occasional political upheaval. Now the entire system seemed unstable, subject to forces beyond any individual's control or understanding. Consider the psychological toll on a merchant family in 9th century Samarkand. The patriarch had built his fortune on the assumption that Chinese demand for Persian goods would remain constant, that the routes through Central Asia would stay open, that the political arrangements between Tang China and the Abbasid Caliphate would remain stable. Now his eldest son returns from Chang'an with news that anti-foreign sentiment is rising, that Chinese officials are restricting trade with Western merchants, that the emperor himself seems less welcoming to foreign influence. What do you do when the world you've known all your life begins to change in ways you can't predict or control? How do you maintain hope when the networks that have sustained your family for generations seem to be unraveling? Yet somehow, remarkably, trade continued. New routes opened when old ones closed. New partnerships formed when old alliances failed. The Silk Road had become larger than any single empire or religion. It had become a force of nature, as persistent and inevitable as the wind that carried caravans across the desert. The torch was being passed from hand to hand, sometimes dropped, sometimes burning brightly, but never completely extinguished. Even as empires clashed and ideologies competed, the fundamental human desire to connect, to trade, to learn from strangers continued to drive people toward impossible journeys and improbable partnerships. But the easy confidence of the Golden Age was gone forever. The world had become more complex, more dangerous, more unpredictable. The Silk Road was entering a new phase, one that would test whether human ingenuity and determination could survive the collision of civilizations. By the year 1000 CE, something was dying along the Silk Road, and everyone could feel it. In the markets of Samarkand, stalls that had bustled with activity for centuries stood empty, their wooden shutters weathered gray by sandstorms that no longer brought the smell of distant places. The great caravanserai, those fortress-like inns where merchants had gathered to share news and negotiate deals, echoed with emptiness. Where once you might have heard conversations in a dozen languages, now there was only the whistle of wind through abandoned courtyards. The Golden Age was over, and the decline came not with a single catastrophic event, but like a slow fever that drained the life from the ancient trade networks, one route at a time. The troubles had been building for generations. The An Lushan Rebellion of 755 CE had nearly destroyed the Tang dynasty, forcing China to pull back from its western frontiers and rely increasingly on tribute rather than trade. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the glittering center of Islamic civilization, was fragmenting into competing dynasties that spent more energy fighting each other than maintaining the infrastructure that made long-distance commerce possible. But perhaps most devastating of all was the rise of local warlords, who saw the Silk Road not as a lifeline to be protected, but as a resource to be exploited. Picture a merchant named Rustam in the year 1050, standing at the gates of what had once been the thriving city of Merv. His grandfather had told him stories of this place, its libraries and gardens, its workshops where craftsmen created goods that were prized from Baghdad to Beijing. Now, as he looks through the crumbling gates, he sees only ruins. The city had been sacked 3 times in the past 50 years by different warlords, each claiming to be its protector. Rustam carries letters of credit from Bukhara, documents that would once have been honored by merchants across Central Asia. But letters of credit only work in a world where people trust that institutions will survive long enough to honor their promises, In this new reality of constant warfare and shifting allegiances, trust has become as scarce as water in the desert. The psychological impact on the merchant community was devastating. Trade had always required a kind of faith that routes would remain open, that partners would honor their agreements, that the complex networks of credit and obligation would hold together across vast distances and long periods of time. When that faith crumbled, the entire system began to collapse. Consider the case of the Sogdian merchant families, who had been the backbone of Silk Road trade for centuries. Their success had been built on reputation. A Sogdian's word was considered as good as gold from Rome to China. But reputation requires continuity, and continuity was exactly what the new political reality made impossible. A Sogdian trader who had spent decades building relationships with clients in Chang'an might return from a 2-year journey to find that his home city had changed hands 3 times. His warehouses had been looted, and his local partners had fled or been killed. Starting over wasn't just a matter of replacing lost goods. It meant rebuilding an entire network of trust that had taken generations to establish. The routes themselves were becoming impossible to navigate safely. Mountain passes that had been guarded by imperial troops were now controlled by bandit gangs who demanded tribute that could exceed the value of an entire caravan's cargo. Desert oases that had welcomed travelers for centuries were now fortified strongholds whose rulers viewed passing merchants with suspicion and greed. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the decline was how quickly the great achievements of Silk Road civilization began to disappear. The cosmopolitan cities where scholars from different cultures had gathered to translate texts and share ideas became provincial backwaters focused only on survival. The libraries where the wisdom of ages had been preserved were burned for fuel during sieges. The workshops where master craftsmen had perfected techniques passed down through generations fell silent as their patrons fled or impoverished. In Dunhuang, the great Buddhist caves that had been centers of pilgrimage and artistic creation for centuries were gradually abandoned. The last dated inscription in the caves is from 1002 CE. A simple prayer for safe travel left by a monk who may have been the last to make the complete journey from India to China via the traditional overland routes. The human cost was immeasurable. Consider the story of Ibn Fadlan, an Arab geographer who attempted to trace the old Silk Road routes in the early 11th century. His journals, discovered centuries later, tell of cities that existed now only in memory, of wells that had been filled with sand, of bridges that had collapsed and were never rebuilt. But most poignantly, he writes of meeting the descendants of great merchant families, now reduced to poverty and working as laborers or beggars. An old man in Balkh claims his grandfather had traded directly with the Tang Emperor's court. A woman in Kashgar shows him a fragment of Chinese silk, all that remains of her family's once great textile business. These people carried in their memories the ghost of a connected world that their children would never know. The decline wasn't uniform. Some routes remained active longer than others. Some cities managed to maintain their prosperity through local trade or special relationships with emerging powers. But the overall pattern was unmistakable. The great transcontinental networks that had linked East and West for over a millennium were slowly dissolving. By 1200 CE, a journey that Marco Polo's grandfather might have completed in 18 months now took 3 years and required the protection of private armies. Routes that had once been traveled by individual merchants with small caravans now required expeditions organized like military campaigns. Yet even in decline, the Silk Road retained its hold on the human imagination. Stories persisted of cities beyond the desert where gold was common as copper, of kingdoms where wise rulers welcomed foreign traders, of routes that could still be traveled by those brave enough or desperate enough to risk everything. These stories sustained a trickle of the most determined merchants, the most devoted pilgrims, the most adventurous explorers. They were like embers kept alive in the ashes of a great fire, waiting for the wind that would fan them back to life. In the caravanserais that still functioned, old men would gather around evening fires to tell stories of the great days, when the roads were safe and profit was measured in camel loads rather than individual coins. Young men listened to these tales with the mixture of skepticism and longing that every generation feels when hearing about times that seem too good to have been real. But the stories served a purpose beyond nostalgia. They preserved the memory of what had been possible, the knowledge of how the networks had functioned, the understanding that distance was not destiny, and that human ingenuity could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The roads were dark now, but they were not abandoned. Somewhere out there, in the spaces between empires and the gaps between certainties, the possibility of connection still flickered. It would take new circumstances and new kinds of courage to revive it. But the embers of the old dreams were still glowing, waiting for someone bold enough to breathe them back to life. The Silk Road was not dead. It was sleeping, dreaming of horses and silk and spices, of monks and merchants, and the eternal human hunger to touch the impossible. In the year 1206, somewhere in the grasslands of Mongolia, a tribal chieftain named Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler, by an assembly of nomad warriors. Within his lifetime, this man would create the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But perhaps more remarkably, he would accidentally resurrect the Silk Road and give it one final spectacular flowering. The irony was lost on no one who lived through it. The man who brought the ancient trade networks back to life did so by first destroying everything in his path. Picture the scene in 1220 as Mongol armies approached the great trading city of Samarkand. The city's defenders could see dust clouds on the horizon for days before the horsemen appeared. Not hundreds or thousands, but what seemed like an entire nation on horseback. When the Mongols finally surrounded the city walls, witnesses reported that their campfires stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, like fallen stars scattered across the earth. The siege lasted only 5 days. When it ended, Samarkand, the pearl of the Silk Road, home to merchants from 40 nations, was a smoking ruin. Contemporary chroniclers claim that 120,000 people were killed, though the numbers matter less than the psychological impact. A civilization that had taken centuries to build was erased in less than a week. Yet within a generation, something unprecedented began to happen. The same Mongol Empire that had destroyed the old order began creating a new one, and it was built specifically to facilitate trade on a scale the world had never seen. Genghis Khan's genius wasn't just military, it was organizational. He understood that an empire spanning from Korea to Hungary couldn't be governed through fear alone. It needed systems, infrastructure, and most importantly, it needed to be profitable. The quickest way to make his vast territories profitable was to revive the transcontinental trade that his armies had initially disrupted. The transformation began with a simple innovation, the diplomatic passport. Called a paisa, it was a tablet of gold, silver, or iron inscribed with the Great Khan's seal. Carrying a paisa meant you traveled under Mongol protection, and nothing in the medieval world was more absolute than Mongol protection. Bandits who had terrorized caravans for generations suddenly found themselves facing the choice between respecting Mongol trade privileges or being hunted down by the most efficient military machine on Earth. By 1230, Mongol-controlled territories had become the safest places on Earth to conduct long-distance trade. A merchant with proper credentials could travel from Beijing to Baghdad with less risk than a modern tourist faces crossing a busy street. The Mongols didn't just protect traders, they actively encouraged them, offering tax incentives, establishing rest stations, and even providing government-sponsored insurance for high-value caravans. The results were spectacular. Consider the journey of the Polo family, Nicolò, Maffeo, and young Marco, who left Venice in 1271 for what they planned as a routine trading expedition to Constantinople. Instead, they found themselves traveling deeper and deeper into Mongol territory, eventually reaching the court of Kublai Khan in China. What should have been impossible, Italian merchants conducting business directly with the Chinese emperor, had become merely unusual. Marco Polo's later account of his travels seems almost fantastical to modern readers, but to his contemporaries, the real wonder wasn't the exotic details he described. It was the simple fact that such a journey was possible at all. For the first time in centuries, a single political authority controlled the entire length of the Silk Road. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, had created what amounted to a medieval version of free trade. The economic impact was immediate and dramatic. Chinese porcelain, which had been a luxury item available only to the wealthiest Romans, became common in European markets. Islamic astronomical instruments found their way into Chinese observatories. European textiles were worn by Mongol nobles in Karakoram. The volume of trade increased exponentially, but more importantly, its character changed. Instead of goods passing through dozens of middlemen over months or years, direct relationships formed between producers and consumers, separated by thousands of miles. But the Mongols facilitated more than just trade in goods. They created the world's first truly global information network. The Yam, the Mongol postal system, could carry messages from one end of the empire to the other, faster than anyone had thought possible. A letter sent from Karakoram could reach Paris in 90 days, a speed that wouldn't be matched again until the invention of the telegraph. This information network had profound consequences for human knowledge. Chinese innovations like gunpowder and printing technology spread westward in decades rather than centuries. Islamic mathematical and astronomical advances reached Chinese scholars while their originators were still alive. European mechanical innovations found their way to Mongol workshops in Central Asia, where they were refined and improved before continuing eastward. Consider the remarkable story of a single piece of knowledge, the recipe for gunpowder. Chinese alchemists had discovered the explosive properties of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal centuries earlier, but they guarded the secret jealously. Under Mongol rule, Chinese engineers were deployed throughout the empire, carrying their technical knowledge with them. By 1250, Mongol armies were using Chinese-designed siege engines powered by gunpowder to attack European castles. Within another generation, European smiths had reverse-engineered the technology and begun producing their own firearms. The speed of this technological transfer was unprecedented in human history. Ideas that might once have taken centuries to cross cultural boundaries now spread in years or even months. The Mongols had created what amounted to a medieval internet, a network that allowed information to flow freely across vast distances and cultural barriers. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Mongol Renaissance was its religious tolerance. Despite their own shamanistic traditions, the Mongol rulers actively promoted religious diversity within their territories. Christian churches, Buddhist monasteries, Islamic madrasas, and Confucian academies all received imperial patronage. Debates between scholars of different faiths were not just tolerated but encouraged. At Kublai Khan's court in Khanbalik, modern Beijing, Marco Polo witnessed theological discussions that would have been impossible anywhere else on earth. Nestorian Christian priests debated Buddhist monks while Islamic scholars consulted with Confucian advisors. The great Khan himself reportedly kept an open mind about all religions, famously asking the Polo brothers to bring him 100 learned Christian priests who could demonstrate the superiority of their faith through reasoned argument. This intellectual cosmopolitanism created an environment where knowledge flourished as never before. Persian astronomers working in Chinese observatories made discoveries that advanced both Islamic and Chinese understanding of celestial mechanics. European merchants learning Chinese accounting methods revolutionized commercial practices from Venice to London. Arab geographers mapping Mongol territories produced the most accurate maps the world had yet seen. But the human cost of Mongol success was never forgotten. The peace and prosperity of the Pax Mongolica was built on the bones of entire civilizations. Cities that had resisted Mongol conquest, Baghdad, Kiev, Aleppo, were destroyed so completely that they never fully recovered. Entire populations were enslaved or massacred. The Mongols created their global empire through a level of systematic violence that shocked even the brutal medieval world. This created a profound moral ambiguity that travelers like Marco Polo struggled to understand. How could the same people who had burned Samarkand to the ground create such a sophisticated system of international commerce? How could rulers who had ordered the massacre of entire cities also patronize scholars and artists from around the world? The answer lay in the Mongol understanding of power. They believed that resistance to their authority deserved total destruction, but submission merited generous protection. Once you accepted Mongol rule, you became part of a system that was remarkably open, meritocratic, and cosmopolitan. The choice was stark: submit and prosper, or resist and be annihilated. This binary worldview created a kind of peace through terror that was both effective and deeply unsettling. Merchants traveling under Mongol protection enjoyed unprecedented safety and opportunity, but they did so knowing that their security depended on a regime that had demonstrated its willingness to erase entire civilizations for defying its will. By 1300, the Mongol Empire was beginning to fragment, but its impact on global connectivity would endure for centuries. The trade networks, postal systems, and diplomatic protocols established during the Pax Mongolica created a template for international relations that influenced how empires and merchants would interact for generations to come. More importantly, the Mongol period demonstrated that true global connectivity was possible. For perhaps the first time in human history, someone with sufficient resources and determination could theoretically travel from Western Europe to the Pacific Ocean under the protection of a single political authority. The world had briefly become one. It was the Silk Road's last great flowering, a spectacular finale to a story that had been unfolding for over a millennium. But already, new forces were stirring that would make the overland routes seem antiquated and dangerous compared to the possibilities opening up on the world's oceans. The age of the sea was about to begin, and with it, the ancient Silk Road would face its final and most decisive challenge. The golden thread that had stretched across continents for over 1,000 years was beginning to fray. Like a tapestry left too long in the sun, the great network of trade routes that had connected east and west was slowly, inexorably coming undone. The causes were many, and they arrived not with the thunder of conquering armies, but with the quiet inevitability of changing tides. In the year 1347, something invisible began its own journey along the Silk Road. It needed no caravan, no guide, no provisions for the desert crossing. It traveled in the blood of rats, in the bite of fleas, in the breath of merchants who had no idea they carried death in their lungs. The Black Death had begun its terrible pilgrimage westward. The plague moved with a merchant's patience and a warrior's ruthlessness. From the steppes of Central Asia, it followed the ancient routes through Kaffa on the Black Sea, where Genoese traders loaded their ships with silk, spices, and unknowingly with doom itself. The same networks that had carried Buddhism and paper, gunpowder and precious stones now carried something that would kill 1/3 of Europe's population. In the trading posts of Samarkand and Bukhara, the first signs were subtle. A merchant would complain of fever, of swollen nodes beneath his arms. By morning, he would be still. His goods would be sold by trembling hands to buyers who told themselves that surely this sickness would not follow them home. But it did. It always did. The caravanserai fell silent, one by one. These great way stations, once alive with the babble of a dozen languages, the lowing of camels, the clink of coins changing hands, became tombs. The courtyards that had echoed with haggling and laughter now knew only the whisper of wind through empty doorways. Sand began to drift across thresholds that would never again know the weight of a traveler's foot. Those who survived spoke in hushed tones of God's wrath, of the end of days. But perhaps it was simply the end of an era. The Silk Road had always been fragile, held together by trust between strangers, by the shared dream of profit and wonder. Death had shattered that trust. Caravans that had once numbered in the hundreds now dwindled to dozens, then to nothing at all. As the plague burned itself out, leaving emptied cities and traumatized survivors in its wake, new powers were rising in the West. The Ottoman Empire, strong and ambitious, had captured Constantinople in 1453, closing the last great Byzantine gateway between Europe and Asia. The Sultan Mehmed II looked upon his new conquest and saw opportunity where Europeans saw catastrophe. The Ottomans were not enemies of trade, they were simply very expensive friends. Each caravan that passed through Ottoman lands now faced taxes and tolls that doubled, then tripled the cost of goods. A bolt of silk that might have cost a Roman senator a handful of gold now required a merchant prince's ransom. The golden thread was still there, but it had become almost too precious to touch. In the counting houses of Venice and Genoa, ambitious men pored over maps and calculations. If the land routes had become too costly, too dangerous, too unpredictable, then perhaps it was time to think differently. The sea, which had always seemed like a barrier, began to look like a highway. Portuguese navigators, funded by princes who had heard tales of eastern riches since childhood, began to probe southward along the African coast. Each voyage went a little further, pushed a little harder against the unknown. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and arrived in India. For the first time in history, European ships had reached the source of spices without paying tribute to a single Central Asian Khan or Ottoman Pasha. The news spread through European courts like wildfire. The sea route to the Indies was not just possible, it was profitable. Within decades, Portuguese and Spanish ships, then Dutch and English vessels, were carrying more Asian goods to Europe than all the caravans of the Silk Road combined. The great overland routes did not die suddenly. They faded, the way stars fade at dawn, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one morning you realize they are gone. Caravan leaders found fewer and fewer merchants willing to risk the journey. The oasis towns, which had grown fat on customs duties and the sale of provisions, watched their populations dwindle as young people left for the coasts, for the new opportunities that lay across the water. In Kashgar and Turfan, in Merv and Balkh, the bazaars that had once buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk began to empty. The Khans and caravanserai masters who had grown wealthy on the passage of goods now found themselves guardians of ghosts. They would stand in their courtyards at sunset, listening for the sound of approaching caravans, but hearing only the wind that had always been there, patient and eternal. By 1500, the great age of the Silk Road was over. The golden thread that had connected civilizations, that had carried the dreams and ambitions of countless merchants, monks, and adventurers across the roof of the world, had finally snapped. The last caravans made their way across the Taklamakan desert, like funeral processions, carrying not hope for profit, but the weight of ending. Yet something had been accomplished in those 15 centuries of connection. Ideas that had traveled with the merchants had taken root in distant soils. The mathematics of India had found new homes in Arab madrasas and European universities. Chinese inventions had transformed Western warfare and communication. Buddhist compassion had touched souls from the Ganges to the Yellow River. The Silk Road was dead, but its children were everywhere, in the tea ceremonies of Japan, in the algorithmic calculations of Baghdad, in the compass roses that guided European ships to undreamed-of continents. The golden thread had frayed and broken, but the pattern it had woven into the fabric of human civilization would endure forever. The wind still blows across the empty caravan routes, carrying sand and memory in equal measure. Sometimes, if you listen carefully in the ruins of an ancient way station, you can almost hear the echo of bells, the creak of leather, the soft conversation of travelers who believed the road would last forever. The golden thread that had stretched across continents for over 1,000 years was beginning to fray. Like a tapestry left too long in the sun, the great network of trade routes that had connected east and west was slowly, inexorably coming undone. The causes were many, and they arrived not with the thunder of conquering armies, but with the quiet inevitability of changing tides. In the year 1347, something invisible began its own journey along the Silk Road. It needed no caravan, no guide, no provisions for the desert crossing. It traveled in the blood of rats, in the bite of fleas, in the breath of merchants who had no idea they carried death in their lungs. The Black Death had begun its terrible pilgrimage westward. The plague moved with a merchant's patience and a warrior's ruthlessness. From the steppes of Central Asia, it followed the ancient routes through Kaffa on the Black Sea, where Genoese traders loaded their ships with silk, spices, and unknowingly, with doom itself. The same networks that had carried Buddhism and paper, gunpowder and precious stones now carried something that would kill a third of Europe's population. In the trading posts of Samarkand and Bukhara, the first signs were subtle. A merchant would complain of fever, of swollen nodes beneath his arms. By morning, he would be still. His goods would be sold by trembling hands to buyers who told themselves that surely, this sickness would not follow them home. But it did. It always did. The caravanserai fell silent, one by one. These great way stations, once alive with the babble of a dozen languages, the lowing of camels, the clink of coins changing hands, became tombs. The courtyards that had echoed with haggling and laughter now knew only the whisper of wind through empty doorways. Sand began to drift across thresholds that would never again know the weight of a traveler's foot. Those who survived spoke in hushed tones of God's wrath, of the end of days. But perhaps it was simply the end of an era. The Silk Road had always been fragile, held together by trust between strangers, by the shared dream of profit and wonder. Death had shattered that trust. Caravans that had once numbered in the hundreds now dwindled to dozens, then to nothing at all. As the plague burned itself out, leaving emptied cities and traumatized survivors in its wake, new powers were rising in the West. The Ottoman Empire, strong and ambitious, had captured Constantinople in 1453, closing the last great Byzantine gateway between Europe and Asia. The Sultan Mehmed II looked upon his new conquest and saw opportunity where Europeans saw catastrophe. The Ottomans were not enemies of trade, they were simply very expensive friends. Each caravan that passed through Ottoman lands now faced taxes and tolls that doubled, then tripled the cost of goods. A bolt of silk that might have cost a Roman senator a handful of gold now required a merchant prince's ransom. The golden thread was still there, but it had become almost too precious to touch. In the counting houses of Venice and Genoa, ambitious men pored over maps and calculations. If the land routes had become too costly, too dangerous, too unpredictable, then perhaps it was time to think differently. The sea, which had always seemed like a barrier, began to look like a highway. Portuguese navigators, funded by princes who had heard tales of eastern riches since childhood, began to probe southward along the African coast. Each voyage went a little further, pushed a little harder against the unknown. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and arrived in India. For the first time in history, European ships had reached the source of spices without paying tribute to a single Central Asian Khan or Ottoman Pasha. The news spread through European courts like wildfire. The sea route to the Indies was not just possible, it was profitable. Within decades, Portuguese and Spanish ships, then Dutch and English vessels, were carrying more Asian goods to Europe than all the caravans of the Silk Road combined. The great overland routes did not die suddenly. They faded the way stars fade at dawn, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one morning you realize they are gone. Caravan leaders found fewer and fewer merchants willing to risk the journey. The oasis towns, which had grown fat on customs duties and the sale of provisions, watched their populations dwindle as young people left for the coasts, for the new opportunities that lay across the water. In Kashgar and Turfan, in Merv and Balkh, the bazaars that had once buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk began to empty. The khans and caravanserai masters who had grown wealthy on the passage of goods now found themselves guardians of ghosts. They would stand in their courtyards at sunset, listening for the sound of approaching caravans, but hearing only the wind that had always been there, patient and eternal. By 1500, the great age of the Silk Road was over. The golden thread that had connected civilizations, that had carried the dreams and ambitions of countless merchants, monks, and adventurers across the roof of the world, had finally snapped. The last caravans made their way across the Taklamakan Desert, like funeral processions, carrying not hope for profit, but the weight of ending. Yet something had been accomplished in those 15 centuries of connection. Ideas that had traveled with the merchants had taken root in distant soils. The mathematics of India had found new homes in Arab madrasas and European universities. Chinese inventions had transformed Western warfare and communication. Buddhist compassion had touched souls from the Ganges to the Yellow River. The Silk Road was dead, but its children were everywhere, in the tea ceremonies of Japan, in the algorithmic calculations of Baghdad, in the compass roses that guided European ships to undreamed-of continents. The golden thread had frayed and broken, but the pattern it had woven into the fabric of human civilization would endure forever. The wind still blows across the empty caravan routes, carrying sand and memory in equal measure. Sometimes, if you listen carefully in the ruins of an ancient way station, you can almost hear the echo of bells, the creak of leather, the soft conversation of travelers who believed the road would last forever. And so we return to where we began, with a single thread of silk caught in the wind above a dusty trail. But now we understand that this thread was never truly single. It was part of a vast tapestry, woven from the dreams and ambitions of countless souls who dared to venture beyond the familiar, who chose connection over isolation, who believed that what lay beyond the horizon was worth the risk of the journey. The Silk Road was never really about silk, just as it was never really a road. It was about the invisible threads that bind us to one another across the vastness of time and space. It was about the recognition that we are all part of something larger than ourselves, that our stories are interconnected in ways we can barely comprehend. Listen now, and you can hear them still. The merchant from Samarkand counting his profits by lamplight. The Buddhist monk chanting sutras as he crosses the desert at dawn. The Roman senator's wife running silk through her fingers and wondering about the hands that wove it. Their voices blend with the wind that still moves across the empty spaces where their footsteps once fell. In the rustle of leaves in a Chinese garden, in the call to prayer echoing across the rooftops of Istanbul, in the clink of coins in a Venetian counting house, the Silk Road whispers its eternal message. That distance is an illusion, that time is a river that flows in all directions at once, that the golden thread of human connection can stretch across any void. The caravans have long since disappeared into legend, but their cargo remains. Not the silk and spices, the gold and jade that crumbled to dust centuries ago, but something more precious and more enduring. The knowledge that we are not alone. That somewhere across the desert or beyond the mountain, Others are looking at the same stars, dreaming the same dreams, carrying the same hopes in their hearts. Perhaps that was always the Silk Road's greatest treasure. Not what it carried, but what it taught us about ourselves. That we are explorers by nature, traders in wonder, pilgrims of possibility. That the urge to reach out, to connect, to share what we have learned with those who hunger to learn is as fundamental to our nature as breathing. The ancient routes may be silent now, marked only by the archaeological fragments scattered across the desert floor and the memories preserved in museum cases. But the Silk Road itself, the great network of human connection that transcended borders and centuries, lives on in every email sent across the world, every friendship forged between strangers, every moment when we choose understanding over fear. Close your eyes now, fellow traveler, and let yourself drift along those ancient pathways. Feel the rhythm of the camel's gait beneath you, the weight of precious cargo swaying in the panniers. Smell the smoke of the evening campfire, the incense burning in a distant temple, the spices being ground in a bazaar that exists now only in dreams. Let the wind carry you across the Taklamakan Desert, where the sand dunes shift and whisper secrets known only to the stars. Let it lift you over the Pamirs, where the thin air carries prayers to the roof of the world. Let it bear you to the oasis cities where time moves differently, where the past and present mingle like water and wine. The Silk Road is calling, as it has always called to the restless human heart. Not to physical journey now, but to something deeper. To the recognition that we are all part of the same vast caravan, all traveling the same endless route from mystery to mystery, all carrying something precious that the world needs. Rest now, weary traveler. The road will be there when you wake, as it has always been, as it will always be. In your dreams you may hear the distant sound of caravan bells, the soft conversation of fellow pilgrims, the whisper of silk in the desert wind. Sleep well, and remember, you are part of the golden thread that connects all things. Your story is woven into the great tapestry alongside the merchants and monks, the emperors and explorers, the dreamers and the daring who walked these paths before you. The Silk Road never ended. It simply learned to travel through human hearts instead of desert sands. And there, in the chambers of memory and imagination, the caravans continue their eternal journey, carrying wonder from soul to soul across the infinite distances that connect us all. The wind grows gentle now, carrying only peace and the promise of morning. The ancient voices fade to whispers, then to silence, leaving only the rhythm of breath and the soft beating of a heart that remembers, even in sleep, that it is part of something magnificent and eternal.